Okay, guys. Lesson number 4. Peter Pan. So, last we left off, we had just recently been introduced to Peter. Kind of. He was only there for a split second. We figured out that he's a character who Mrs. Darling had heard of in her childhood as being a fairy who helped children cross over. And we also know that Wendy seems to know very well of Peter, and Mrs. Darling said that she finds him in the thoughts of Wendy's brothers as well. We only saw Peter for a split second as an actual character in the book before he jumped out of the window and vanished like a star into the sky. But Nana closed the window very quickly and caught Peter's shadow. So Peter Pan's shadow is left behind. It's just hanging out. It doesn't really move or do anything. And so they decided to store it away. And they thought maybe Peter Pan would come and get his shadow eventually, and he would like to have it, so they kept it somewhere safe. However, in the very last part of the reading, we saw Mr. Darling, Mrs. Darling, and Nana all having this sort of discussion about that fateful night, they kept saying, right? That awful, fateful night. Apparently it was a Friday, and they all blamed themselves for whatever happened. But we don't know what happened yet. So maybe today we'll find out. We'll have to see. If you want to follow along with our reading today, go ahead and go to the link in the description. So if you go to the description of this video, click the button, there's a little link to the reading. You click that link and it opens up the book Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie right there on your laptop or on your phone, and you can follow along with the video. I want you to catch up to where we're at if you're not already at the spot. So go ahead and click on the control key. It's the CTRL key, control, and then F like fun. So hold control, and while you're holding it, press F. Control F, boom, boom. When you press Control F, I want you to type in the words, they would sit there, and that by itself should take you to the spot we're at. Okay, it's right at the beginning of chapter 2, and it says, they would sit there in the empty nursery, recalling fondly every smallest detail, etc., etc. That's where we're at now. So today we're going to be reading for a while, and then when we finish the reading, I'm going to have a little homework assignment for you, as well as a special announcement. So stay tuned. Trust me, you're going to want to hear this. Without further ado, let's pick up where we left off in J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. All right. But they would sit there in the empty nursery, recalling fondly every smallest detail of that dreadful evening. It had begun so uneventfully, so precisely like 100 other evenings, with Nana putting on the water for Michael's bath and carrying it to him on her back, or carrying him to it on her back. I won't go to bed, he had shouted, like one who still believed that he had the last word on the subject. I won't. Nana, it isn't 6 o'clock yet. Oh dear, I shan't love you any more, Nana. I tell you, I won't be bathed. I won't. Then Mrs. Darling had come in, wearing her white evening gown. She had dressed early because Wendy so loved to see her in evening gown, with the necklace George had given her. She was wearing Wendy's bracelet on her arm, and she had asked for the loan of it. Wendy loved to lend her bracelet to her mother. She had found her 2 older children playing at being herself and father on the occasion of Wendy's birth, and John was saying, I'm happy to inform you, Mrs. Darling, that you are now a mother, in such a tone as Mr. Darling himself may have used on the real occasion. Wendy had danced with joy, just as the real Mrs. Darling must have done. Then John was born, with the extra pomp that he conceived due to the birth of a male, and Michael came from his bath to ask to be born also. But John said brutally that they did not want any more. Michael had nearly cried. Nobody wants me, he said, and of course the lady in the evening dress could not stand that. "I do," she said. "I so want a third child." "Boy or girl?" asked Michael, not too hopefully. "Boy." Then he had leapt into her arms. Such a little thing for Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana to recall now, but not so little if that was to be Michael's last night in the nursery. They go on with their recollections. "It was then that I rushed in like a tornado, wasn't it?" Mr. Darling would say, scorning himself, and indeed he had been like a tornado. Perhaps there was some excuse for him. He too had been dressing for the party, and all had gone well with him until he came to his tie. It is an astounding thing to have to tell, but this man, though he knew about stocks and shares, had no real mastery of his tie. Sometimes the thing yielded to him without a contest, but there were occasions when it would have been better for the house if he had swallowed his pride and just used a made-up tie. This was such an occasion. He came rushing into the nursery with the crumpled little brute of a tie in his hand. "Why, what is the matter, father dear?" "Matter?" he yelled. He really yelled. "This tie, it will not tie." He became dangerously sarcastic. "Not round my neck, round the bedpost. Oh yes, 20 times have I made up round the bedpost, but around my neck, no, oh dear no, begs to be excused." He thought Mrs. Darling was not sufficiently impressed, and he went on sternly. "I warn you of this, mother, that unless this tie is around my neck, we don't go out to dinner tonight. And if I don't go out to dinner tonight, I never go to the office again. And if I don't go to the office again, you and I starve, and our children will be flung into the streets." Which, just as a pause, if you guys remember, this is a logical fallacy, right? Logical fallacy, pause the video, see if you can guess it. Slippery slope. Logical fallacy, slippery slope, where you take one event and you paint a very slippery slope and how the event becomes this awful, awful situation. When really, that probably all isn't true. If he can't tie his tie, everything will probably be okay. But Mr. Darling is very serious, and so he's using a slippery slope to try and convince them of his seriousness. Even then, Mrs. Darling was placid. "Let me try, dear," she said, and indeed that was what he had come to ask her to do. And with her nice, cool hand, she tied his tie for him, while the children stood around to see their fate decided. Some men would have resented her being able to do it so easily, but Mr. Darling had far too fine a nature for that. He thanked her carelessly, at once forgot his rage, and in another moment was dancing around the room with Michael on his back. "How wildly we romped," said Mrs. Darling, now recalling it. "Our last romp," Mr. Darling groaned. "Oh, George, do you remember Michael suddenly said to me, 'How did you get to know me, Mother?'" "I remember." "They were rather sweet, don't you think, George? And they were ours, and now they're gone." The romp had ended with the appearance of Nana, and most unluckily Mr. Darling collided against her, covering his trousers with hairs. They were not only new trousers, but they were the first he had ever had with braid on them, and he had had to bite his lip to prevent the tears coming. Of course, Mrs. Darling brushed him, but he began to talk again about its being a mistake to have a dog for a nurse. "George, Nana is a treasure." "No doubt, but I have an uneasy feeling at times that she looks upon the children as puppies." "Oh no, dear one, I feel sure she knows they have souls." "I wonder," Mr. Darling said thoughtfully, "I wonder." It was an opportunity, his wife felt, for telling him about the boy. At first he pooh-poohed the story, but he became thoughtful when she showed him Peter Pan's shadow. "It's nobody I know," he said, examining it carefully, "but it does look a scoundrel." "We were still discussing it, you remember," says Mr. Darling, "when Nana came in with Michael's medicine. You will never carry the bottle in your mouth again, Nana, and it is all my fault." Strong man though he was, there's no doubt that he had behaved rather foolishly over the medicine. If he had a weakness, it was for thinking that all his life he had taken medicine boldly, and so now, when Michael dodged the spoon in Nana's mouth, he said reprovingly, "Be a man, Michael." Won't! Michael cried naughtily. Mrs. Darling left the room to get a chocolate for him, and Mr. Darling thought this showed want of firmness. "Mother, don't pamper him," he called after her. "Michael, when I was your age, I took medicine without a murmur. I said, 'Thank you, kind parents, for giving me bottles to make me well.'" He really thought this was true. And Wendy, who was now in her nightgown, believed it also. And she said, to encourage Michael, "That medicine you sometimes take, Father, is much nastier, isn't it?" "Ever so much nastier," Mr. Darling said bravely, "and I would take it now as an example to you, Michael, if I hadn't lost the bottle." He had not exactly lost it. He had climbed in the dead of night to the top of the wardrobe and hidden it there. What he did not know was that the faithful Liza had found it and put it back on his washstand. "I know where it is, Father," Wendy cried, always glad to be of service. "I'll bring it." And she was off before he could stop her. Immediately his spirits sank in the strangest way. "John," he said, shuddering, "it's most beastly stuff. It's that nasty, sticky sweet kind." "It will soon be over, Father," John said cheerily, and then in rushed Wendy with the medicine in a glass. "I've been as quick as I could," she panted. "You have been wonderfully quick," her father retorted, with a vindictive politeness that was quite thrown away upon her. "Michael first," he said doggedly. "Father first," said Michael, who was of a suspicious nature. "I shall be sick, you know," Mr. Darling said threateningly. "Come on, Father," said John. "Hold your tongue, John," his father rapped out. Wendy was quite puzzled. "I thought you took it quite easily, Father." "That is not the point," he retorted. "The point is that there is more in my glass than in Michael's spoon." His proud heart was nearly bursting. "And it isn't fair. I would say it, though, with my last breath. It isn't fair." "Father, I am waiting," said Michael coldly. "It's all very well to say you're waiting. So am I waiting." "Father's a cowardly custard." "So are you a cowardly custard." "I'm not frightened." "Neither am I frightened." "Well, then take it." "Well, then you take it." Wendy had a splendid idea. Why not both take it at the same time? "Certainly," said Mr. Darling. "Are you ready, Michael?" Wendy gave the words 1, 2, 3, and Michael took his medicine, but Mr. Darling slipped his behind his back. Very tricky. There was a yell of rage from Michael, and "Oh, Father!" Wendy exclaimed. "What do you mean by 'oh, Father'?" Mr. Darling demanded. "Stop that row, Michael. I meant to take mine, but I missed it." It was dreadful the way all three were looking at him, just as if they did not admire him. "Look here, all of you," he said entreatingly, as soon as Nana had gone to the bathroom. "I have just thought of a splendid joke. I shall pour my medicine into Nana's bowl, and she will drink it, thinking it's milk." It was the color of milk, but the children did not have Father's sense of humor, and they looked at him reproachfully as he poured the medicine into Nana's bowl. "What fun!" he said doubtfully, and they did not dare expose him when Mrs. Darling and Nana returned. "Nana, good dog," he said, patting her. "I've put a little milk into your bowl, Nana." Nana wagged her tail, ran to the medicine, and began lapping it. Then she gave Mr. Darling such a look, not an angry look. She showed him the great red tear that makes us so sorry for noble dogs, and then crept into her kennel. Mr. Darling was frightfully ashamed of himself, but he would not give in. In a horrid silence, Mrs. Darling smelt the bowl. "Oh, George," she said, "it's your medicine." "It was only a joke," he roared, while she comforted her boys, and Wendy hugged Nana. "Much good," he said bitterly, "my wearing myself to the bone trying to be funny in this house." And still Wendy hugged Nana. "That's right," he shouted. "Coddle her. Nobody coddles me. Oh, dear no. I'm the only breadwinner. Why should I be coddled? Why? "George," Mrs. Darling entreated him, "not so loud. The servants will hear you." Somehow they had got into the way of calling Liza the servants. "Let them," he answered recklessly. "Bring in the whole world. But I refuse to allow that dog to lord it in my nursery for an hour longer." The children wept, and Nana ran to him beseechingly, but he waved her back. He felt he was a strong man again. In vain, he cried. "The proper place for you is the yard, and there you go to be tied up this instant." George, Mrs. Darling whispered. "Remember what I told you about that boy." Alas, he would not listen. He was determined to show who was master in that house, and when commands would not draw Nana from the kennel, he lured her out of it with honeyed words, and seizing her roughly, dragged her from the nursery. He was quite ashamed of himself, and yet he did it. It was all owing to his too affectionate nature, which craved for admiration. When he had tied her up in the backyard, the wretched father went and sat in the passage with his knuckles to his eyes. So we can assume that he's either crying or He's really frustrated. He's thinking to himself like this. I want to pause and talk a little bit about Mr. Darling, you guys. Mr. Darling is an interesting character in that he's showing us, or the author, J.M. Barrie, is showing us through Mr. Darling an important lesson about being an adult. You know, I think as we read the book and as we do dive into Neverland, we're going to be exposed to more. The term here is foil. Have you guys ever heard of the word foil? I think we studied it once or twice in the beginning of the year quickly with the Metamorphosis. A foil, F-O-I-L, that's a character who is directly opposite to one of our main characters. And by being directly opposite, that character helps accentuate, helps exaggerate, helps make great the qualities of our main character. Now, Mr. Darling probably will not be a main character throughout this book, but right now he is. And he's setting us up so that when we engage with Peter Pan, or maybe Wendy, or maybe Captain Hook, we're going to see the way adults act by Mr. Darling, and the way maybe adults should act by the innocence of the children in Neverland, and by the way Peter Pan acts. Or maybe it's somewhere in between, and we'll have to figure that all out. But take good note of the way that Mr. Darling acts. He's ashamed. It says in that sentence, he was ashamed of himself, and yet he did it. So he felt really bad about the joke that he pulled. And it was pride that pushed him to do it, but he couldn't really stop himself. And I don't know about you guys, but I think there have been plenty of situations in my life where I had pride about something, and I kept going with it, whether it was an argument or an action, and I knew I was in the wrong, and I knew what I was doing wasn't okay, but I was too proud to give up. I think we all experience that sometimes in our life. Like when we know that we should clean our room, but we don't want to, so we argue about it. When we really know our parents are right and our room should probably be cleaned up. It's good, I think, to let go of that pride. Just think of how much better the situation would have been if Mr. Darling would have let his pride go, said that he struggled with medicine, maybe taken the medicine, but definitely let his pride go enough not to be mean to Nana. So I think maybe we're going to see a difficult situation arise, or a bad situation arise, out of Nana's not being around. We are going to wrap it up pretty soon here. We're almost at the end of chapter 2. When we get to the end, I'll give you your assignment. So let's keep going. In the meantime, Mrs. Darling had put the children to bed in unwonted silence and lit their nightlights. They could hear Nana barking, and John whimpered, "It is because he is chaining her up in the yard." But Wendy was wiser. "That's not Nana's unhappy bark," she said, little guessing what was about to happen. "That's her bark when she smells danger." "Danger! Are you sure, Wendy?" "Oh, yes." Mrs. Darling quivered and went to the window. It was securely fastened. She looked out, and the night was peppered with stars. They were crowding around the house, as if curious to see what was to take place there, but she did not notice this, nor that one or two of the smaller ones winked at her. Yet a nameless fear clutched at her heart and made her cry, "Oh, how I wish that I wasn't going to a party tonight." Even Michael, already half asleep, knew that she was perturbed, and he asked, "Can anything harm us, Mother, after the night lights are lit?" "Nothing, precious," she said. "They are the eyes a mother leaves behind to guard her children." She went from bed to bed, singing enchantments over them, and little Michael flung his arms around her. "Mother," he cried, "I'm glad of you." They were the last words she was to hear from him for a long time. Number 27 was only a few yards distant, but there had been a slight fall of snow, and Father and Mother Darling picked their way over it deftly, not to soil their shoes. They were already the only persons in the street, and all the stars were watching them. Stars are beautiful, but they may not take an active part in anything. They may just look on forever. It is a punishment you put on them for something they did so long ago that no star now knows what it was. So the older ones have become glassy-eyed and seldom speak, winking is the star language. But the little ones still wonder. They're not really friendly to Peter, who had a mischievous way of stealing up behind them and trying to blow them out, but they are so fond of fun that they were on his side tonight, and anxious to get the grown-ups out of the way. So as soon as the door of number 27 closed on Mr. and Mrs. Darling, there was a commotion in the firmament, and the smallest of all the stars in the Milky Way screamed out, "Now, Peter!" And that's the end of chapter 2. Wonderful. So, we are certainly at an exciting point in the book. We've been led up to show the way that Wendy and her brothers, John and Michael, act. We've seen Mr. and Mrs. Darling. We've even gotten some serious foreshadowing that the kids are going to be gone for a while on some adventure. We've been introduced lightly to Neverland, and we've even seen Peter once, and his shadow is stuck in the house. Nana, too, has been an important part of the book, and as we go on, we're going to see an extreme development of these characters. For homework, I want you guys to read into chapter 3, okay? Chapter 3 is a little bit long, so you don't have to read the whole thing, but I want you to read until the sentence... Let me see. Read until you get to the sentence, "Surely you know what a kiss is," she asked, aghast. "I shall know when you give it to me," he replied stiffly, and not to hurt his feelings, she gave him a thimble. Okay, so go ahead and read until you get to that sentence. It's about halfway through chapter 3, maybe a third of the way through chapter 3. Go ahead and read until there, and then write me a summary of what's happened in the beginning of chapter 3, and in a second small paragraph, so your summary should be one small paragraph of maybe 4 sentences or so. In the second small paragraph, I'd like for you to write what you think is going to happen going forward in chapter 3. That's pretty much it for the reading today, and that's it for the homework. If you have any questions, you can always send me an email, or, even better, please pop into my Zoom office hours from 8:30 to 9 a.m. on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Just come on in. We can go to a breakout room, or we can chat as a group and talk about any questions that you have about the homework or about the book, anything you're noticing, stuff like that. We're already a fair way into the book, so we'll definitely finish it before the end of the year if we keep reading at this speed, so that's great. And on a final note, the teachers are holding a little competition each week, a little drawing. If you have 2 ways to enter this drawing. If you complete all of your con assignments for your teachers, for Ms. Cordello, for Doc, and for Ms. Feldbauer, and for any other teachers who have con, then you get entered into that drawing where you can win a $25 gift card. For me, since I have so many con assignments, you do not have to complete them all. You just have to complete like a few, so I know that you're working on them. Okay, I want you to be working. If I see you're working, you'll be entered into that from my side. The second way you can be entered into the drawing is if you get the homework done from the videos, or maybe a teacher will have a secret code in their videos, something like that, and you show up to our Zoom calls or email us telling us the homework or the secret code or whatever each teacher says. In my case, it's the homework. So if you get the homework done and you email it to me or you bring it to me on Zoom, you will be entered in that second drawing to get a $25 gift card, okay? Which is really cool. We really want to get you guys watching these videos because even though we're not in normal school right now, we still have to continue education. It's very important. I don't think there's anything else to cover, so I'll let you guys go for the day. I hope to see you tomorrow morning on my Zoom call at 8:30 to 9 a.m. And if not, I hope you have a great weekend. Bye, guys.